We are still following today's Oval Office meeting, that incredible exchange between the leaders of the United States and Canada, where Prime Minister Mark Carney told President Trump his country is unequivocally not for sale. Let's bring in our panel. Megan Messerly is a White House reporter at Politico. Julia Manchester, a national political reporter for The Hill. Ladies, good to see both of you. Megan, the Prime Minister had to walk that fine line today, complimenting the President to some extent, being diplomatic, while making sure he made very clear, as he did at least once or twice, that Canada isn't for sale. How do we think he did?
You know, I think talking to people going up to this meeting on both the Canadian side and the U.S. side, we knew that this 51st state jab that the president likes making at Canada was going to come up, and it was going to be a challenge, and it was going to be a test for Prime Minister Carney to see how he dealt with it. And I think the thinking is that he sort of dealt with it in the best way he could, right? He needed to, you know, for sake of his own political future, maintain that Canada is not for sale. This is not up for discussion, while at the same time sort of maintaining this jovial, friendly atmosphere with the president. And I think he was sort of able to sort of strike that line. You know, we saw, you know, him mouth back to the camera at one point, you know, never. Which was sort of a striking moment, but just sort of speaks to that sort of way. And I will mention some allies of the president's who I had been speaking with ahead of this said this is exactly how Prime Minister Carney needed to approach this. He needed to sort of be a little playful, be firm, obviously, in his stance, but that the president would respect that, you know, so long as he sort of treated it in a jovial manner. We didn't go the Zelensky route.
And I see, you know, nothing will top that, at least not yet. But I thought it was interesting that in the run-up, you also had administration officials trying to play this down, like, oh, it's not that big a deal. This is the biggest economic relationship the United States has. And despite what the president was suggesting today, that we don't want to do business with China or with Canada, we don't want Canadian-made vehicles, the reality is we do, because so many different industries do so much work up there.
Absolutely. And Canada is obviously one of the U.S.'s closest allies, right? There's this longstanding relationship between the two countries. I think what it came down to, and we were hearing this in the days leading up to this meeting, is, you know, I was asking people in the White House, I was asking, you know, allies outside the White House saying, you know, what does the president think of Prime Minister Carney? And they were like, he honestly just doesn't. He doesn't have thoughts on him yet, you know, like he hated Prime Minister Trudeau. It's not that. So that was a step up. But I think what we saw out of today's meeting is, you know, the president was very laudatory of Prime Minister Carney. You know, he even said later in an event, you know, that he was sort of a step up from Justin Trudeau, congratulated him on the election win. So I think we've seen sort of the foundations for a much better relationship, obviously, than the one he had with Prime Minister Trudeau.
Julie, up on Capitol Hill there, the Republicans at least trying to work through a budget proposal. Big aspect of that will be the future of Medicaid and whether or not or how much do you cut out of it? How do you rearrange it in such a way that saves money but doesn't cost Republican seats? And there's now a conservative organization essentially providing some air cover to Republicans who are taking it on the chin from left-leaning groups concerned about the future of Medicaid, right?
Yeah, this is really the first time we've seen Republicans come out in a unified voice in many ways to push back against these Democratic attacks, accusing them of looking to cut Medicaid. This is from the American Action Network, which is a sister organization to the Congressional Leadership Fund. They're spending $7 million in 30 congressional districts, in Republican and Democratic districts, essentially touting Republicans, what they say is their connection to Medicare, Medicaid, what they've done to do that, and attacking Democrats for supporting the Inflation Reduction Act, attacking the Biden pill policy, as they call it, which they say would essentially weaken research into, potentially life-saving drugs, et cetera. So this is where Republicans are really looking to push back against Democrats. But still, there is a lot of concern right now among Republicans. In fact, just over the last hour, we saw Congressman Rob Whitman, who represents Virginia's 1st congressional district, not exactly a toss-up, but Democrats are targeting that district, come out and say, look, I told Steve Scalise and Mike Johnson that any sort of cap on per capita spending or any sort of lowering of federal match spending would be a no-go, essentially. So there are still a number of moderates and Republicans in swing districts who aren't comfortable with where leadership is, and leadership is trying to essentially balance those Republicans with the hardcore fiscal hawks from the Freedom Caucus who want deeper cuts.
And that's interesting that a Virginian is saying that, knowing that there's a governor's race later this year in Virginia, where this inevitably would become an attack on Republicans. So they must be seeing something now in the polling that suggests don't go there, even in the Old Dominion.
Absolutely, and it kind of, just to zoom out to look at Virginia, I mean, Virginia is so fascinating, obviously, because it's so close to Washington, D.C. You have so many federal workers. You have so many people living, even though Rob Whitman's district is in the Henrico area, the greater Richmond area, it's so close in proximity, relatively close in proximity to Washington, D.C. So this is a good test case for them.
We heard today from the Treasury Secretary regarding trade talks, and there's been some hope that there'd be some announcements regarding India, South Korea, maybe the UK this week. But he acknowledged something on China that the president has not.
Yes.
And what is that?
Yes, he made clear that there are not talks happening right now, which is something that the president has tried to imply in varying degrees. You know, a week ago, I asked him on Air Force One, I said, you know, have you talked to President Xi this term since taking office? And he said, I don't want to talk about that. And so now we're
despite telling Time Magazine that he had talked to him.
Yes, exactly. But he was never firm about the time frame in which he had talked to him, which is the big challenge. So yeah, what we're hearing now from the Treasury Secretary is this confirmation of what we've long suspected, which is that these talks are not happening, even as the administration is very eager to tout some sort of a win this week. Again, not clear whether that's actually going to come to fruition. White House official told me yesterday it could be 0 deals, it could be 5 deals. We really don't know. And so I think this sort of just speaks to the state of flux that we're in right now with tariffs, right? As Secretary Besson and others work to negotiate these deals one by one. We're still hearing, you know, India had, like, I keep hearing India, Japan, South Korea, I keep hearing, you know, you have to wait till after their election, but you could get some sort of framework in place. The UK popping up today, obviously that deal was already, you know, somewhat in progress before Liberation Day and all of this started. And so the question now is, which one is going to come first? But the bigger question is what's going to happen with China, because even if you go announce a deal with one of these other countries, that does not eliminate these pain points with China and the massive tariff war that we are in with them.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about one of the other big political developments this week, Julia, the decision by Georgia Governor Brian Kemp not to run. The jockeying now to run has got to be pretty intense down in Georgia. Yeah,
well, first, I think arguably a bit of a recruiting loss for Republicans at the Senate level. I mean, a lot of Republicans I've talked to have said, look, we always knew this would be a possibility. But Brian Kemp is someone who has been very successful in Georgia, running statewide, towing that line between MAGA and maybe more establishment Republican. But now you have a plethora of different Republicans starting to jockey. You have Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is not ruling this out. She'd certainly do well in a Republican primary, but in general election against Jon Ossoff, a lot of questions there. John King, insurance commissioner, he's really an up-and-coming name. Buddy Carter, a congressman, he appears to have ruled this out. You have Rich McCormick, another congressman who is said to be considering this. So this could be a pretty big Republican primary, but it's important because Jon Ossoff is arguably the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent. So if you have a Republican limping out of a bloody primary, that hands it in many ways to Democrats.
545 days to go until Election Day 2026. Maybe you heard. Lots can happen between now and then. Megan Messerly and Julia Manchester, thank you for being here.